Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Red Nation podcast. Thanks for joining us this morning. We have a very special guest, Jared Ball, who is host of I Mix What I Like on Black Liberation Media. Jared Ball is a scholar in communication studies. Jared, do you want to just introduce yourself? I was on your show twice, I think. So it's great to have you
Something
on
like
our
that.
show.
No, first of all, it's an honor to be here. I really appreciate the invitation to this very important platform and for this important discussion. I'm looking forward to it. I feel like I've learned a lot just in trying to keep up and prepare for this last couple of weeks. But again, my name is Jared. I am professionally a professor of Africana and media studies at Morgan State University in Baltimore, Maryland. And I have just, for the most of my adult life, tried to be involved with and support any number of radical, underground, unsanctioned movements and ideas. So, So I do a little media work, a little bit of activism, and but try to be supportive of all that kind of work. Yeah.
Well, first off, I just want to say that in the last year and a half, I guess, there's kind of two things that have really clarified my thinking on a lot of things. I think one was the genocide and the resistance to it in Palestine, and the second one, as I was kind of seeing this, flood of media and this sort of apologia that's coming out of, even progressive media around Zionism and sort of if not explicitly, then implicitly sort of criminalizing resistance and self-defense of Palestinians. I was like looking in the media, besides just looking at Palestinian sources, I kind of fell back, and like my bookshelf in some ways got smaller, and like what I listened to, what I watched got like more sharpened and focused. And I think I ended up landing on like Black Liberation Media, and I've just like that's kind of really what I can only watch on YouTube these days. And so I really like it's been, and especially your show too. I've been watching some of your back catalog episodes and interviews, and it's been really helpful because it confirms a lot of the things that I've sort of experienced in the project that we're trying to create at Red Media. So I just wanted to give you a shout out and a thank you because I think like Black Agenda Report and BLM, Black Liberation Media, is always keeping it real, like solid, and it's fascinating that this kind of gets into the pieces and the conversation that we're going to have today. But it's very fascinating how sort of the Black radical tradition is very much in vogue in the academy right now, but we're not hearing your voice, like voices such as yours and Black Liberation Media. So I wanted to kind of give you an opportunity to maybe talk about your media vision with that, because I think we have a lot to learn with it, as American Indian people and trying to do something similar.
Wow. Yeah. So it's interesting you said that. First of all, I want to acknowledge and thank you also, because there's a vice versa happening here as well over the last couple of years, becoming more familiar with your work and what your collective here are trying to do. And recognizing that I have a perennial, just me, not full blind spot, but an insufficient spotlight on the struggles of Native people, Indigenous people here, and the overlaps with other radical movements. And then also specific to the topic here today, given the reading that we were doing on the issue of settler colonialism. So I really appreciate what you are doing. For me, the Black Liberation Media Project has been something that I've been focused on as an idea for a long time. In fact, I was, the very first thing I ever published anywhere was a co-written article with my comrade, Dr. Todd Stephen Burrows, who was sort of an elder guide for me, not an elder, but an older guide. He's just a couple years older than me. But we did this thing called the search for B-span, the idea of having a Black C-span, but with the idea of having a Black radical public sphere, as we saw, this is almost 30 years ago at this point. But as we saw the evolution of what is now this fully evolved digital media environment, we saw what was on the horizon. If you just understand the history, the predictive future is not that hard to see when looking at particularly this situation. So we saw that digital technology was going to evolve, was going to get better, more sophisticated, more easy to use, more inviting, lower barrier for entry, but that it was also going to make it harder for organized radical Black voices to be heard anywhere. They were going to get even more marginalized. So the idea was, when we enter these spaces, to do so more as a collaborative, collective effort. That was at least the idea. There's a much longer and complicated story behind that we're still struggling with, but that was at least the goal. That the idea was never what we're encouraged in today's environment more than ever, that individuals will launch this and individuals will do that and individuals and I will get followers and I will get likes, and but we really need our public spherical changes, so to speak, that where we can get groups of people to gather and discuss, debate, center a whole different set of ideas. And that's what we've been trying to do. So that's why with certainly with Black Liberation Media, you get a variety of the Black radical tradition, and what we're trying to create is a constant dialogue with each other and with other similarly oppressed and situated and struggling communities. So I hope that answers your question, but that's in short, and I would always encourage, and then we could always talk more, but YouTube in particular discourages that kind of work. But I think that is, at least as a baseline approach, I do think that is the only way to make any value of these media spaces for the kind of work that we're trying to do.
And your channels was like demonetized or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. What was the content that what was the content that got you demonetized?
So, well, the content let me, to be perfectly fair to you and to your audience, some of this we would have to start with an off the record conversation, because unfortunately I can't speak on behalf of the entire situation as an individual, because it's a broader thing. But the short of it is that the combination of lack of principle in the context of what is already an environment hostile to these ideas set us up to be targeted, and then for YouTube to easily identify, isolate, and say no, they're pretty much finished. And I will say, it was interesting in the back and forth I had with whoever was claiming to be the representative on the other side of the screen, who claimed to not be a sophisticated bot, which I accused them of. Is that it really is ideological and political. And they were very vague. They were just saying, it could be this, it could be that, and it's always this, but what I will say is that they definitely don't want discussions around decolonization. They don't want discussions that go left of the Democratic Party for solutions. And if you are presenting as a certain set, politic, I think they're quick to pull the plug. So that's essentially what I think the issue was, and is facing a lot of us.
Yeah, I mean, even we've been singled out by several groups. I can't even remember what they're called anymore. It's just right-wing sort of groups that troll and monitor our platforms, and they sort of cherry pick things that they think are controversial. And I remember we did this talk here in Minneapolis around Palestine and Indigenous solidarity, and there were some I'll just be honest, there's some people on stage who were not affiliated with our group who were saying much more radical things than we were, but they focused in specifically like in a very gendered and racialized way on what Indigenous women were saying, and tried to create sort of some kind of narrative around that ended up on Fox News. It landed us on some lists. We used to do like a program called Freedom to Read, where we would send books to reservation libraries, tribal libraries, community spaces, as well as incarcerated Native people. And we got flagged for that because we had a Palestinian writer on there who's considered a quote unquote terrorist. So that was a way that they were kind of like going after us in very bizarre, ways. But yeah, and also at the same time, there you have to have discipline and you have to have principles, because there's a lot more at stake. And I think people kind of dismiss the work we do as, oh, you just get on you just get on a mic and say whatever you want. And it's like, well, I could, what I do and what I say here could actually land me in the hot seat, for a lot of reasons. So I actually have to do a double check on, a lot of things that I'm saying and doing, whereas if you're promoting a genocide on YouTube, you're probably going to get promoted, and nobody's going to say anything about it.
Well, it's that old joke that if you kill one person, you're a murderer. And if you kill a million, you're a hero, a war hero.
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah. And it definitely, yeah, sorry. Yeah.
No. They're just handing out fellowships to war criminals. I just saw Mike Pompeo got a prestigious sort of fellowship at Columbia University.
Perfect. But yeah, no, so first I wanted to say, I almost never say publicly exactly what I want to say. So so there's always, but the goal, just quickly, the goal, as I've understood it, is always to, what George Jackson for me said it best, that we need three things for a revolution. We need a secret army. I'm not doing that. I'm not a part of that. I acknowledge that. So he said we need an alternative political party. I'm definitely happy to help build that. And then he said we need an unsanctioned, as I'll describe it, press that will help popularize the idea of revolution. So that's really what I see, my small amount of contribution trying to be, at least, that to say, I want to encourage people to feel like there should be, and then to get them to go to spaces to do where that work would actually occur. And that's, and you mentioned Black Agenda. I always like to point out, rest in power to Glenn Ford, that I liked his approach, that Glenn Ford always said that with Black Agenda, the goal was not to reach a mass audience. The goal was to reach the sector of activists, scholars, journalists, media makers who need help with a certain form of analysis that encourages them to better levels of organization and an increase in their work. So that's another kind of thing. It's antithetical to this world of more subscribers, more likes, more views, bigger audience. But I like that kind of, and then you don't have to worry about watering down the message too much, trying to create too big a tent to where you're just really just a liberal outpost of some kind. So I kind of like that also. But
yeah, for
that's
sure.
At least a struggle.
I think it's like there is a disciplining effect there, like with chasing clickbait and all that stuff. And we've noticed, we've weathered the storm. I'm just going to be honest, we've weathered the storm than some of our I guess I wouldn't call them peers, but some of our allied sort of organizations who depend on like large donors, who, when they start talking about Palestine, boop, there goes daddy dollars, like
Absolutely.
they're gonna pull that stuff right away. And we are fundamentally membership funded, which is a great pitch right now. So if you're not a member, join our Patreon. We also have a GoFundMe. We're raising some money right now just to kind of keep this channel free and independent from an Indigenous, left, and anti-imperialist perspective. Check out the YouTube comments. Go to our Patreon at patreon.com/redmediapr and subscribe for as little as $2 a month. So without further ado, let's jump right into this conversation. You had me read a piece, and I really appreciated it because as I've been following your work and watching your channel, and also engaging with a lot of comrades in the Black left, this concept of internal colonialism comes up a lot. And I guess before we get into your piece, maybe you could just provide a definition of what you mean by internal colonialism.
So yeah, so for me, internal colonialism is an attempt to put Black America back into the world stage of events. So it's my version of it, and I have to you know qualify it a little bit. Is I was trying to create sort of a hodgepodge for the work I was doing, but essentially I was trying to really borrow from initially a Black nationalist tradition. Emerges a little bit with as I learned more today, a Marxist tradition, for today. But the idea was just that Black people form or constitute a nation and have a relationship to the United States that is one of an internal colony, that is one colonized within the United States, itself a settler colony. That part of it I didn't really address too much, but for me the point was just to say I wanted to to reset the relationship back into what previous generations of radical activists and scholars had been doing, and saying that, look, what is happening to Black people here in the United States is more or less what has been happening to Nigerians in Nigeria, Ghanaians in Ghana, Panamanians in Panama, and so on and so forth, and with less of a focus, again, to the point I was making earlier, similar or parallel to what was happening to the genocide of indigenous people who were already here. So and as I've tried to just summarize outside of writing, just in conversation, that African people were snatched, enslaved, dragged over here to be enslaved and colonized in a land that was at the same time settler colonizing and genociding the indigenous population. I didn't focus on many of the differences we're going to look at today between these experiences. I was trying to focus on the similarities, and maybe even to a fault overemphasize them, to say that let's focus on the similarities so that we can develop a common struggle. And in the case of my work, to say, look, if everybody's writing about hip hop, let's be a little bit more honest. And then at the time, there was a lot of discussion that's now doesn't exist anymore around the hip hop nation and nationhood. And people were trying to define the hip hop community as its own separate nation. And I never liked that for a number of reasons. One of which, as I tried to point out in my work, was that it masked the colonization and the colonial relationship held here, which would then confuse what was going to happen with hip hop. And so on and so forth. So I just tried to use the history of the rap music mixtape to say, if you look at traditions of national, dissident, unsanctioned communication in the context of colonization, you will better understand what the rap music mixtapes history is saying to us about Black people, brown people, and hip hop itself. So so that's basically, that's I guess, maybe not, yeah, that's how I've approached it. And by the way, and I did want to remind, as I think I mentioned, that I did want to connect what I was doing and to try to revive a wing of thought that had been sort of pushed more again to the margins by the time I was rediscovering it in the early 2000s. So there is this, again, I wasn't creating something new. I was trying to sort of maybe reignite and reapply a theoretical approach again to the mixtape and to rap music.
Yeah, I kind of like think back in my own political consciousness and how that developed. And, native people, like everyday native people, don't call themselves like colonized necessarily. They don't use that language. And I think what our expression of that colonial relationship is our idea of a nation, right? And the fact that we are distinct and we're kind of like, spatially, territorially, culturally, but also temporally, where we always say we're on a different timeline than the United States. We pre-existed and continue to exist in spite of, and perhaps afterward, whatever comes next. And so, but I was also thinking, I was really struck by, the analysis that you provide. And, I don't know much about hip hop. I'm going to be honest. I'm not a cultural studies person. I can barely read art. And I don't read a lot of novels. and stuff like that. But I felt like what you were talking about here kind of extends into some of your other critiques of this idea of like Black capitalism. But in your analysis, you write, the emancipatory potential of the mixtape is found in the colonial contradictions described even by Marx, where the most alienated, marginalized, and or colonized also represent the most threatening, potentially revolutionary elements, precisely because of those conditions of separateness and dislocation from mainstream modes of production. And you kind of very definitely kind of talk about how the mixtape isn't itself like a revolutionary element. It can be, right, because it can also be co-opted, and it has been co-opted. And I think if a lot of non-Black people or people who aren't Black engage Blackness through cultural production, right, and the consumption of Blackness. And I was wondering if you could just maybe talk a little bit about that, because it is, I've listened to a lot of your podcast episodes, and you like really like get into the weeds on a lot of this stuff. But maybe you can give us like a general overview of what that looks like.
Well, the short of it is that part of what I was trying to argue and am trying to argue is that because of this relationship, this foundational relationship of colonization, anything that ends up happening as a result of that gets fit to that process. It doesn't, so there was a moment where people were arguing, well, because we can make mixtapes and because now we have rap music, that there is an avenue towards freedom, or the same way they said, well, the internet's here, we don't need record labels anymore. And now the music industry is more consolidated and managed than ever. So because that fundamental relationship never changed. So I was just trying to say, if you don't understand or recognize, let's focus on the relationship. And I was saying, I may not get it exactly right. And per the stuff we were reading for today, it could be argued in a number of ways. My definitions are needing some work. But what I was just trying to say is as others had been saying in different ways, in different contexts, that the role Black cultural expression has played in the United States has been very particular and always wedded to what is pop culture in the United States. And it's always been politicized. It has always been part of the maintenance of the social order, either giving people a chance to express themselves and just blow off steam so they don't rebel, or more often providing entertainment for a white affluent audience. And with that sort of fundamental purpose never being altered, as hip hop emerged, it again took on the same, so when it is forced and imposed on audiences here and around the world as part of the cultural industries, and for the political purpose of entertaining, providing messaging, distraction, public opinion manipulation, and so discussions and arguments around, is it going to free us? How can we use it to get free? It is proving our, all of that is to me absurd and missing the point, and has always been absurd and missing the point, and has always caused me to be in a lot of arguments and debates with people around this. But again, I hope I'm getting to your question. But that's I still like hip hop, especially locally, as Dr. Buses means I should question even harder. Yeah. Well, if you like it, you should question it even more. But yeah, that's but that's the point, that there's a politics to it. There's a politics of popularity and celebrity, and the role Black cultural expression plays is very specific in this country. So that was just trying to get, to say, look, we need to understand that, be clear on that, and then recognize how, as Fanon said, the cultural expression of the colonized will be used to testify against its progenitors. So that's yeah. And I just thought, and I'm sorry, just quick, but I thought just like what we were looking at for today, however imperfect my version is, somewhere in there, it's just better than this idea that there's a populist free enterprise potential
Mhm.
here, or that people can who are oppressed can art their way to freedom. I don't, I've never liked that. It just doesn't make any
Mm.
sense. So that I just, yeah, I wanted to challenge that.
Yeah, at the same time, you also kind of note this dismantling of, I guess, historic Black institutions, like of media production. I mean, we're seeing that now, like even with in Native journalism. A lot of I know a lot of folks in Native journalism, and they're no longer with like Native outlets. They're kind of been subsumed within these larger legacy media
Mm.
projects. And when you do that, and this is kind of like a larger critique that you have, is like when you do that, your pen, like your audience gets, or your the donor class, or the people who's like writing your paycheck, they're going to be the ones who are determining the content that you're producing, right? And then you're producing writing, or you're producing media, not to maybe produce confidence in the class, or the group of people that you come from, the community that you come from, to change things or to question things, but you're producing commodities that are essentially going to be bought and sold.
Oh yeah.
And you use like Steve Biko as an intervention, both in your name of I Mix What I Like, as his, he, because he does Black consciousness journalism, right? And it's not yeah, I don't know, like, can you maybe explain that, and like why that is a critical intervention, and why it's important to think of these cultural mediums and institutions as colonized spaces that need anti-colonial thought and action.
So again, I have to say that, because Dr. Burroughs got me into the PhD program at the University of Maryland to study journalism, the privilege, honestly, the best part of it is that I got to be introduced to the history of the field of mass communications research in this country, in the United States. And without them saying it in exactly the way we would might have say it in our conversation, they are saying media are here to colonize. They're here to help
Mhm.
the settler colonial process. They're here to set to set attitudes, agendas, to make white people feel better about themselves, to make good Negro American citizens, to turn Eastern Europeans into good white Americans, to all of to do the slow motion version of what was attempted with residential schools
Mhm.
for Native people. It's we have to turn them into something else. So for some, it was industrial schools for the formerly enslaved, residential schools for the former proper owners of this land. It was for my European descended immigrant mother's side of the family. It was those small pamphlets that they would hand out in the streets of early New York City to tell Eastern Europeans how to clean themselves and pick up after themselves and be good American. Like it's like this whole everything. So when it comes to now, within that though, of course, is the dislocation and the rebranding of self-concept and personhood and identity. And to the extent that any of those communities might start to challenge, then a variety of systems are in place to manage that, of course, with the violent, arm of it always ready.
Mhm.
So so it is true that I Mix What I Like comes from what Steve Biko was doing, and I write what I like in his journalism columns in Azania or South Africa. And when I was working with mixtapes, and as a pun to jokes to me being mixed, I said I mix what I like. And
Mhm.
really, my homeboy came up with that. I got to give him credit. But the idea was to use the mixtape and to write about the mixtape in the same way that, or in a similar way that Biko was trying to do his work, with the idea that there needs to be a Black consciousness that understands the context, in this case of colonization, and advocates and works, as to the best of best way possible against all of that, to inform and to challenge all of that. um and yeah, so that's I think I lost sight of the full question again, but that's
It was
yeah.
like, why is it helpful to think of ourselves like as, fighting within this colonized, space? And
Oh, so right. I'm sorry. So that's why. So because of all of that, that media systems are in place to suppress all of that consciousness. So part of it is to co-opt and invite people into certain spaces, and through unconscious self-censorship or direct editing, limit what is said. Uh, what is very slickly happening, so, in some spaces, because of the new digital media environment, there's a new form of a black commercial press emerging that is still
mm,
following the same traditional model, that it may cut out some editorial middle people, so to speak, but the pursuit of white advertising and white eyeballs creates, again, consciously or not, a form of production and framing and analysis that is suited to those audiences.
mm,
So if someone is working for or consciously uh in pursuit of, on their own, white advertising dollars, corporate advertising dollars, and white affluent eyeballs, there is going to, by necessity, be an adjustment, conscious or not, to the work that's being done. So that's why I've always liked the idea of emancipatory journalism, the philosophical approach that says activists need to be producing the media that informs their communities and their organizations, et cetera, and so forth. And to the extent possible, not be part of a professional class of journalists who, by default, cannot produce the kind of work that is necessary. So,
mm.
as I've always encouraged, including very recently, if someone, maybe someone you end up knowing, or a comrade or a colleague, is invited into these spaces and feels that they cannot avoid them, just be very clear, produce what you have to produce for them, do the
Right.
best that you can, and then you're going to have to do a whole bunch of other work on the low, or aside of, in supplement of that, to help your actually help your community.
Mm,
But there has to be recognition of the limitations, and I think sometimes there's a blurred line between people thinking, well, I'm doing the best I can, I have this big audience, I have this big paycheck, but I'm still saying something vaguely about my community. um and they confuse themselves into not, I think, being honest enough to recognize the limitations of that situation, and then finding ways to supplement that elsewhere. um
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and it's not to knock my friends, who do this work, because I do know that they struggle with it, and they try to,
Mhm.
they are trying to do exactly what you're pointing out that they should be doing. And I also kind of push back a little bit on this idea of a activist journalism, because I would say that, like, we had a really great interview with Frances Hasso, who's a Palestinian scholar, and she talks about how Palestinians who are not just Palestinians, but in general, people who are, like, you know, affiliated or part of leftist, like, guerrilla movements, often tend to be categorized as sort of like dupes of Marxism, or dupes of, Stalinism, or whatever, category. But people who are in service of empire are not considered dupes, are not considered activists, but they are, in effect, they're activists, or dupes of empire, or the Democratic Party, or counterinsurgency campaigns. So in some ways, that kind of notion of activism separates as, like, oh, this is a unique, exceptional form, but that's actually what you are doing. Not you, but, like, the
No,
hypothetical
yeah.
you,
Mhm.
the man, that's what you're doing. You're coming into this institution and saying, that what I do is legacy journalism. But in many ways, you're like you're a stenographer of State Department whims, like, whether you consciously know that or not. And so I always, like, kind of I think about that, because it's like, in some ways, like, even this, I do subscribe to these principles of activist research, something that I've done a lot. I teach it in my class, but it's harder to do when you're explicit about it, because there's
Mhm.
levels of peer review and repression. I've been subpoenaed to federal cases for the things that I've written, right? Like, that's a
Oh,
that's a
wow.
huge stake, like, I got to do a whole podcast episode on that situation, because I was actually outed by another scholar as potentially witnessing quote unquote illegal activities. There's a whole
Oh,
question of
wow.
ethics. For me, it's like, it's fascinating how, like, me as a native scholar gets, subpoenaed to a federal court case, but this person who is essentially informing to DOJ attorneys on the things that I'm allegedly witnessing is not losing her position or her
Right.
job because of violating research ethics. She's studying indigenous social movements and talking to DOJ attorneys. Like, you can't get like higher than that. Like, it's not like, it's not like you're just like casually
Wow.
having a conversation with somebody. It's like you're talking to attorneys for the DOJ who represent the FBI, like
Yeah, that's
it's,
wild.
but that's not considered activism, right? But my journalism or my writing is subject to scrutiny. So, like, yeah, anyways, that's a whole nother point. It kind of
Well, they're the
going a little far.
establishment and you're the insurgent. That will
Yeah.
that's part of the that's what I'm saying. Like
Yeah.
that's so it's that relationship that without an understanding of that, we will be confused here. So that's wild. That is yeah, you should, if you haven't already told that story publicly to the extent you can, I think, yeah, please do.
Yeah, it was a whole 6 months of my life that I cannot get back. But
Man.
kind of to go back to this conversation, I wanted to know if you can maybe talk a little bit about before we move into this other kind of question of what is settler colonialism, but how Blackness is used as a weapon of US empire, specifically in the realm of media and culture, but also in institutions where Black people, and this applies to Native people too, by the way. It's not, I'm not trying to single out a group of people, but how Black people are seen to excel in, the military, the culture industry, or even the CIA, or
So I gotta give her work a shout out here, Dr. Erica Edwards in The Other
mm,
Side of Terror, and
mhm,
in her discussion of imperial grammars of Blackness, and is fascinating to me. And in part, what she's talking about are the ways, and she uses 9/11 as a turning point in how this was done, or what version of it we get. But the well, in this world, the post 9/11 need to project formerly, in my language, colonized communities as part of
mhm,
the process, you get more Black representation. This is why, again, I always quote Kwame Ture saying importantly that Black visibility is not Black power. Because he was
mhm,
saying 50 years ago, he was recognizing again the shift that was going to happen as the colonization becomes more intense or persistent and technology more sophisticated. There's going to be the corruptive and co-optive elements are going to be more accessible. So the ability to uh, more to encourage and invite more Black participation in commercials, in television, in film, in playing the roles of the police and the
mm,
military. To in the early 2000s, when Spike Lee was tapped to create Navy commercials to target Black and brown communities with a sort of swag that he could bring to the commercial to say, whatever, you know. Um, and in terms of readings that we were doing for today, I'm thinking that one of the key differences, because as I said, Black people, African people in this country have had a very particular relationship to US American pop culture. It has a very specific history. But in the context of these readings, I am thinking of it as maybe more along the lines, and I can't wait to hear what you think about this, of the distinction that these articles are in some cases trying to make between the forms of colonization and then just the flat out genocide of indigenous people. So
mm,
in other words, if if because of maybe numbers and a different particular history and relationship, Black people, it is easier to say, look, we you know, numerically, they're just too many. We got to put them on TV. We got to put them playing CIA. You know, Native people, numbers are down, organized more, you know, in these concentration camps. We don't need to bother with having the police captain be a Lakota and the Air Force pilot being a Cherokee, in the same way that we got to find the Black representations of this. Maybe the stabilization of the nightmare was such that the needs could be amended slightly differently. And when I was growing up, of course, one of the most, or maybe all of the most famous representations of indigenous folks were white men, in makeup. It's like down to the dude in the commercial
still are
over the litter.
Ways. Yes, still are in some ways. Some of them become academics. That's a show. That's a show for that's a different podcast show. You and I've had off-air discussions.
And I got to learn more about. We got to, because I keep another one we have to revisit off the air at some point. I look forward to that. But so anyway, but that's kind of what I was thinking, in a slightly different from this, but in this context, in this moment with this question, along those lines, that the and in terms of the work I'm doing mostly now, that like it's very overt. Mm-hmm. The state has been very clear. We need to get these Black people off of this Black power definition of being socialism and Pan-Africanism and armed struggle, and get them onto business suits and political careers and entertainment. Otherwise, they're going to be even more of a problem. So there is an overt expression of this. And then in the white world, they have their own version, where it's like, we got to turn these folks into consumers and workers and non-unionized workers and all that kind of. So there is a version of this happening, targeting everyone in very specific ways for the very particular histories. But again, I feel like I've lost sight of the original question, but that's where I'm headed with it.
Yeah. Just to kind of backfill some of the or to add context to some of what you said, like, Native people, I think people think of, like, they kind of have a binary thinking of empire and settler colonialism, where the military just went out onto the plains and massacred Native people, which it did happen, but there were Native people who were conscripted into that process. There were always Native auxiliaries to the colonization of the West, and the military conquest of the West and the continent. And I think no better example exists than the kind of direct line from outright exterminatory warfare to the boarding school or the residential school system. You have Colonel Pratt, who was fielded with formerly enslaved African people fighting in the Union Army alongside poor white people, and then kind of excluded from that because they had citizenship were the auxiliaries, the Native scouts who fought alongside them. And so after everyone got done killing the Indians for the day, Black and white people ostensibly went back to being citizens. Of course, we know, like, it's a complicated history, but to say the least. But Native people were sent back to the reservation with no rights, no citizenship. And he said that's a morally abhorrent way to reward people who have engaged in empire building, who've engaged in this sort of military citizenship. So we have to discipline them and to introduce the kind of universal form of a kind of martial citizenship to Native people to fully assimilate them into the kind of American fabric. And so he invented what we now know as off-reservation boarding schools, and they weren't schools. He envisioned them as basically boot camps, right? And he introduced military discipline, patriotism, flag worship, you know, that people didn't really learn anything. They learned how to like march in drills and things like that. And it's fascinating too, because this becomes the sort of tradition, or the invented tradition of the native warrior, right? Where we have high rates of enlistment, because after like his school, Carlisle Industrial School, the most infamous of them, shuttered its doors, the United States enters World War One, and these students, quote unquote, had basically received boot camp training. You know, they were already disciplined in the military arts. They enlisted in, you know, sometimes it was coercive, sometimes it was voluntarily done, but they enlisted as non-citizens for the army to fight in World War One, because they were already trained in military, you know, tactics. And so this becomes kind of this mythology of, you know, of service, and you know, kind of the idea of the veteran warrior. And you know, you have military helicopters, you have missiles being named, quote unquote, in honor of native people, right? But it really goes back to that, you know, the idea that killing Indians was a unifying factor for, or created racial harmony, as Pratt saw, you know, amongst black, white, and native people, or empire building. So that's
By
kind
the
of that
way,
history. Go ahead.
just that marching around you talked about, there is a like a cultural imperial effect in that. And I,
Oh yeah.
because when that's where I served a 4-year sentence in the United States Navy, and a lot of what we did was that marching around, walking around. But even in that, the way you have to march, the way you have to walk, the way you have to talk, the way you have to hold a flag, the way you have to have reverence, the way certain messages are being conveyed, it's like it is very subtle, you know. And now it's funny you mentioned it. One of the few, maybe the only indigenous person I remember meeting was a Navy SEAL, of
Mhm.
all the, like, the most rare groups. And I remember we were talking one day, and I just, because he had to work anyway, I had to work with him, and I just knew he had a different look, and I was just young and ignorant, was just like, "Where are you from? Like you Latino?" I think I probably said something stupid like that. He was like, "No, I'm Cherokee," and I was like, "Damn!" I was like, but it was rare, it was weird, it was, and then we ended up playing chess, and he ended up, if I was older or more sophisticated, or more well read, or had better any understanding at all, the conversation would have been better, because I think he was actually trying to convey some of these subtle messages, like he was
Mhm.
conflicted. Even at the high level of special forces that he was conflicted about his role there. Um, Anyway, I don't know. Sorry about that.
No, I mean, it's my
It was just weird. Yeah.
family. I have a lot of family who have served, you know, and
Mhm.
it's interesting how that's narrated, because that's a whole nother story. I don't want to get into that, but
That's
it is,
another
it's,
episode. Yeah.
yeah, that's another episode. And we've done some of these, you know, we've interviewed native veterans, and talking about
Mhm.
the poverty draft, and that sort of thing. But
It's very real.
it is, and you know, like we do have a voluntary army, but it's fascinating how it's very much subsidized by the colonized, you know, and it has been, not just like recently, but like that's like that's the story of every empire, though. Like people think like World
Mhm.
War II was just fought by a bunch of white people or white Europeans, and it wasn't. It was fought in like
Not at
many
all.
different continents. And
Yeah.
that goes back to like even the imperial wars on this continent, you know. The 7 Years War was like considered like a you know, one of the first world wars, and that was fought
Mhm.
on many different continents, and it was fought by native people. It was fought on, you know, fought by different, you know, colonized people who were conscripted into the army in service of empire. But anyways,
No,
this
there's no such
actually is,
thing as a volunteer army. It's
no,
just
this,
who's more honest about drafting. But yeah.
yeah, it's true. And but this kind of like, it's a good segue into
Mhm.
this other piece that we read by John Bellamy Foster, um
Yeah.
and talking about like how settler colonialism, you know, is an integral part in, you know, what he calls like the world's imperial system. And I just want to point out, like, we had other readings that we were going to read, but we kind of focused on this one. And I think if folks want to kind of delve more in depth to this, they should read, Max Isle produced 2 articles kind of critiquing Patrick Wolf and trying to understand settler colonialism within an imperialist context. I think John Bellamy Foster is looking more at like the Marxist tradition and does a little bit of Marxology and trying to locate it within that. But yeah, I don't know. Like, do you have any like thoughts right off the bat? Because I don't know if you've engaged in settler colonial theory before.
Not, I've only really just begun, and I had added. It's funny because a couple of the pieces that were referenced and authors referenced, I have been adding to my course syllabi lately. But this was a beautiful. I love when this happens. It's a beautiful exercise in humility. It was just because so much of what we were reading, in particular, the how do you say his name, Max Isle, the Max, in that article, there's so much that I haven't gotten to. I don't think I fully understand. I have questions about. I did take a couple of notes, so I'm happy to follow wherever you would want to go. But I just wanted to, again, I just publicly thank you for the invitation to do this, because this has been great. To be introduced to some things and be reminded of some things, to see where might be some flaws here or there, but but yeah, I just love I love this kind of stuff. So yeah.
Well, I guess like I could just start by
Yeah.
laying out settler colonialism, and it, for me personally, I was introduced to this term through reading the piece that's criticized the most or critiqued the most in all these articles, which is Patrick Wolf's The Elimination of the Native. And that was where I was really and that was a piece that was published in the Genocide Studies Journal, or Journal of Genocide Studies, which I think is interesting because he's talking specifically about kind of doing this comparative analysis of settler colonialism in the Anglosphere, and looking at the colonization of the Zionist colonization of Palestine, which was very controversial at the time. But as I've kind of looked at the archive, I was like, wow, this conversation has been around for a while. Like, even looking back into the archive around the Red Power movement, I found a lot of cross-pollination with Palestinian fighters and resistance movements, as well as the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, where they were using this language to describe the Bantustan system, to describe the refugee camp as essentially just a reservation, and how this was part of an imperialist system, and that's what they called it. That's what these Red Power activists called it. But I think the main point that Patrick Wolf is saying is that there's kind of 2 thrusts in his argument. Is that the logic of elimination, like what defines settler colonialism, is the logic of elimination, and the idea that settler colonialism is a structure, not an event. It's not just a one-off invasion. It's something that is unfolding. It actually creates the foundation of society that's organized around the elimination of Native people. And this happens, as he points out in this piece, through various means, whether it's physical extermination, or, as we talked about, the kind of assimilative function of like boarding schools. And I think both Max Isle and John Bellamy Foster offer cogent critiques of this, and saying that this kind of becomes for lack of a better term, a culturalist analysis or a post-colonial analysis that actually delimits the focus, and sort of removes it as a form of colonialism, and exceptionalizes it to kind of very strict notions of what settler colonialism means, kind of leaving out and pulling it apart from, on one hand, I think was the most important element that Max Isle points out, is national liberation movements, and on the other hand, the world imperial system, because we're not doing, Wolf is not doing a Marxist analysis of capitalism. He is not doing an anti-imperialist critique. he's looking at it in such a way that it almost becomes hermetically sealed, and if it doesn't meet these kind of strict definitions, it doesn't count. That and then also, I think John Bellamy Foster does a good job in saying that that's not a class analysis, that's a Weberian analysis.
That's funny.
Meaning it's like focusing on who is a settler, right, versus what is settler colonialism, and I think that's an important kind of critique in many ways, because I do see that the question of settler colonialism as being kind of reduced to, for lack of a better term, an identity politics of who counts as settler and who doesn't count as settler. And when I teach settler colonialism in my courses, it's like, people kind of get uncomfortable with the term, well, am I a settler? And it's like, that's not what this is about, and by definition, you are a settler. Yes. That's actually true. I ease into it. I trick them into it, though. I don't have to be so like explicit. But the point is like, when we sign treaties, you are in that treaty as a non-native person. You are a signatory. Like your government signed that treaty on behalf of you. Like your rights are defined against ours. So by law, you are, right. And there's a whole kind of superstructure of laws that implicate you and ostensibly. When there's a case against native land claims, the state is intervening on your behalf as a non-Indian claimant, whether you like that or not. That's the point of like identifying, this problem as well, this issue in the structure, so that we can change it, right? And I think that's what's really lacking in settler colonial theory as we've come to understand it in the academic discipline, because the radical revolutionary origins of thinking about it were not to, just kind of explain its existence, but it was to actually overturn its existence. And we can see the issue that arises, especially like in the Algerian context, where Fanon was writing. That was a very violent revolution, right? That was a very costly revolution. And if we look at the Palestinian context, like that's a very costly and violent, anti-colonial liberation, decolonization struggle. I think it's easier for people to, as much as they want to critique and say settler colonialism is bad, to study it within this kind of safe, realm of academia and ideas. So, yeah, I don't know what if you have any, I kind of just jumped on a soapbox there, but if you have any thoughts.
No, I love that. I appreciate it. Well, my initial thoughts are actually questions, because I am not familiar very much with Patrick Wolf's work, and I know he was the subject of a lot of the critique here. So just quickly, I was wondering, because I'm not sure, I don't feel like I got this part from the articles. But one, if he was to distinguish someone or a group as not being or suffering settler colonialism, what then was he saying that they were experiencing? And then the second one, in one of these articles, Wolf is made to look, by my estimation, really bad in his understanding of the Black American experience. At one point, is it how do you say Max's last?
Isle.
And is it Isle who points this out, that he says, now I can't remember which one it is, but Wolf seemed not to be able to distinguish between various political trajectories within Black liberation struggles. So he didn't seem to understand that there were people who were looking at this as a national liberation struggle, to the point that was so those are two sort of base questions that I had before we got into anything more substantive, because
I think he's talking about in the context of like, I think in the African, like the experiences of colonization within Africa, nations of Africa, as franchise colonialism, meaning it's about the extraction of resources or the exploitation of labor. And so his idea, again, going back to this kind of Weberian analysis, is the idea of the settler farmer, right? To demographically replace, right, native populations. It's almost, you know, that's kind of his analysis of saying like the settler is the qualifier, right? Because the settler then takes the place of the native, whereas in a franchise colonial sense, they're not really interested. Like if you look at like India, they're not really interested in like replacing the Indian populations that exist, so much as they're looking to just extract labor and resources. So that he's like, that's fundamentally different. Whereas the settler colonial project is to actually establish a state. It's almost like state formation that completely replaces what, you know, destroys to replace, essentially, and to build up. It has a negative and a positive connotation. A negative meaning that it's negating the native, doesn't see them as valuable, other than to, you know, to kill, essentially, and to take their land. But then the positive connotation is that through those resources that are accumulated, building up the state from that. And of course, within his formulation, and this kind of gets to that second part that you're talking about, is Black people kind of get reduced, I think, this is the critique, they get reduced to just being laborers, right? Whether they're enslaved or freed. And that, you know, that he doesn't see them as a colonized population. And that's why, you know, I wanted to have this conversation, because I do think, based on what I understand of the Black freedom struggle, and I, you know, I could be wrong, I don't know, but it and even like the way that Red Power activists engage with the Black freedom struggle, you know, if you read Custer Died for Your Sins by Vine Deloria Jr., he's very critical of Martin Luther King Jr., but he praises, or excuse me, he's critical of Martin Luther King Jr. for being assimilationist, essentially. And he's very sympathetic to Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael, for talking about peoplehood and nationhood. And he's like, that's the real, you know, that's the real crux of the problem of both Native and Black people in the United States. And he's like, you know, he goes on in different contexts to argue that there are only three groups of people who have been brought in as entire peoples when they were made citizens, and that was, you know, Mexican Americans after the annexation, the imperial war and annexation of northern Mexico, a third of Mexico, formerly enslaved Black people after emancipation, and American Indians in 1924 with the Indian Citizenship Act. Those are only the three categories of people who have been brought in as entire groups of people. And he's like, so legally, even the United States treats them as people, you know, as distinct nations, right? And there's laws that are created specifically kind of delineating that understanding of them as distinct nations, or nations, however you want to describe it, within the bigger, quote unquote, you know, white daddy nation of the United States. And I think what Max Isle is saying here is that, you know, what Wolf does is he kind of just flattens that, you know, that kind of trajectory, in saying that, you know, I'm not going to look at the Black liberation, you know, the Black liberation ideology, or looking at like this is a national liberation struggle. But if you read the documents, this is literally what they were saying.
So this was one of my problems. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. No, please finish that. No, please finish your thoughts.
No, and I would say that like that actually, there was a lot of cross pollination with the Red Power movement, because when Black Power was enunciated, like months later, Red Power was enunciated, not in competition with each other, but Clyde Warrior was very much influenced and friends with Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael, and they saw them as co-constitutive forms of empowerment, you know, and radical ideology that was confrontational, as well as building like distinct communities of people in opposition to empire. So that's I'm adding a lot of color, you know, metaphorically and literally to these arguments, to kind of put it in the context of a more productive conversation between us.
Yeah, no. So that was one of the things that I noticed in Max Isles piece, the missing reference to someone like a Walter Rodney, or to which has been a big flaw in my own work, to the struggles of political prisoners here in the U.S., to even the more recently organized and republished. So this is no fault of anybody who's already been writing on this, but the work has been there, like the Black Liberation Army documents,
right?
All of which, my point being that all of them make varying references to the colonization of African people here and elsewhere, and this was always one of the issues that I had, and that I once fantasized I would play a bigger role in addressing, is that when it comes to the discussion of colonization, Black America often gets left out. And I know that's just my own myopic bias, but like even in and I've always been bothered by this, again, you know, it's just in oh, what's my man's name? He wrote The Darker Nations. And everybody knows.
BJ Prashad.
Prashad.
Oh,
that was the one issue that Prashad.
Yeah.
The dark, Prashad, you're right. That was the only issue that I had with the book, is that he's talking about all these different groups that were struggling in an anti-colonial way, and he left out Black America. And I just was like, but there is a very decidedly anti-colonial defined wing of that struggle that takes place here, that a lot of folks seem to ignore. So when I read that line in Isles' article about Wolf, and you even just used the word, Wolf's later work flattened out inequality into unequal access to liberal bourgeois subjecthood, and equality is incorporation into multicultural liberal democratic institutions. And then later in the paragraph reminds us that Wolf's conception of this is far from the totality of the struggle for economic democracy, including economic rights, socialism, and national liberation, ranging from even Dr. King, I added even, from Dr. King to Fannie Lou Hamer to Malcolm X. So in there, in the reference to Kwame Ture and others who use even Du Bois defined Black America as a semi-colony. So there's this long tradition of that I would have liked to see more in these, but that's just, you know, and I think it's part of a problem within Black America in terms of the self-concept and understanding of the particular struggle here, and then in the broader world discussion that would want to not include African America as part of that process. But yeah, those are like two just simple sort of questions that I had there, and then the points about the BLA being, I would have liked to see them or more of that brought in, but yeah, let me let you keep going with.
No, I think those are really excellent points, and yeah, it's I think when this was formed, I think of this in ways like, because it's part of my own education. Like we were educated in these institutions. Yeah. Even Jesse Jackson called us an internal colony in the 1980s. The understanding had been suppressed and erased. Yeah, that's true. And I think, I'll be honest, like when I was indoctrinated into this literature of settler colonial theory, that was something that was kind of like, oh, Black people are not colonized like the way that Native people are. And I think what happens because we were reading Patrick Wolf, and a lot of people were saying this, and then people try to do these really kind of like advanced, I don't know, confusing things to like make it like to argue things, and it's not clear. It's what happens. I think the critique here that's happening of Wolf is that it actually muddies the waters. It doesn't provide clarity. It doesn't provide an analysis that is actually kind of useful in some ways. And for me, it's like been, I'm in the same boat as you, where it's like I was on the Patrick Wolf train for a long time, like thinking that this is, even my book, very much kind of follows that trajectory. I don't fully engage his theories as like, I don't fully, internalize his theories within my conception, because I think he doesn't talk enough about resistance in my mind, and like the category of resistance, and what makes these these kind of forms of organizing dangerous to the settler state. And part of that happens, with like understanding these as nationhood or nationalism, because it's like, you even read FBI documents, they're like interested in Black nationalism specifically, and as you pointed out, Pan-Africanism. They're trying to like destroy that. And there's a reason why Kwame Ture, we don't know a Kwame Ture, but we know other figures in that time period from SNCC. Like what was that other guy's name? I can't remember. He became a leader.
Is it John Lewis from SNCC?
Yeah, John Lewis. Yeah, so we know John Lewis, but we don't know Kwame Ture, right? Or Stokely Carmichael, as he was known at the time. And I think I was troubled by that, because we, even in Native studies, we kind of do this white red binary, or white native kind of binary, and we're not thinking about liberation. We're thinking about structures of power, and that's useful. But when I talk to elders, that's not how they were imagining themselves in that time period. They were like, yeah, when we formed AIM, like the Soul Patrol came from Northside and like helped us, taught us how to do all this stuff, because they've been doing it for years before we did, our community patrols. And like, even to this day, when there are, issues in the Native community, you always have a presence of like, Black folks who are part of that struggle, both in the past and currently, who are showing up and identifying. But the problem is that the people who write these histories, in this case, the FBI, is looking, it's choosing its own leadership. The media that's coming in is defining the issues for us. The people who are the intellectuals are demonized and criminalized. We don't care. We can't read this crap. This is like, this is a revolutionary. Kwame Ture, he's just a radical race essentialist, right? That word has actually been used against Native people a lot. Oh, Elizabeth Cookland, why is she talking about Palestine? She was writing far before Patrick Wolf was on these issues, but we don't, she was considered a race essentialist. She was written off. People just thought she was mean too. I know her, like I knew her, she passed away, rest in power, but she was very critical. She was sharp, and she always defined the struggle of Native people within the context of a colonial relation and an imperial relation. She was very clear. And if you deviated from that analysis, she would write you a very, very sharp and critical letter. I was on the receiving end of a lot of that, but she's not propped up as somebody, within that tradition, as somebody who was theorizing, or thinking about these things. And it becomes, as I think these authors that we read today for this article, or for this conversation, kind of talk about as being sort of defanged in ways that become acceptable. And we, I sent you this in the email exchange that we had, but that's why you get, the Settler Colonial Studies Journal issuing what could ostensibly be called an apologist statement for the genocide in Palestine, right? The journal, the premier journal, who has, made careers out of, for scholars who are studying settler colonial theory, is issuing this like both sidesism statement about, the so-called, I think they call it the Israel-Palestine conflict. I think they removed it from their official website, but but you can still find the artifact of it on the internet somewhere.
So if I can, so I want to relate that last point you're making to a question that I did want to ask you. In a moment ago, you said that for your for your book and earlier in your work, you didn't you said something to the effect, if I heard you correctly, that you didn't see Native people as colonized as in the way, or Black people as colonized in the same way. And I agree that there are differences, and I don't know that we should, for the purposes of investigation and study, overlook any of those differences. As I said at the beginning, I feel like maybe to a fault especially given these readings, maybe to a fault, to only want to highlight the similarities. But I did want to ask that well, given what you just said, I'm just rephrase it slightly. That you Well, essentially, I just wanted to ask you what you thought about what these articles were saying about the different forms,
Mm.
the differences. So, for instance, could it be that the journal is justifying its apologetic stance for genocide, in that this is where I'm really new to this, in that in I forget which one it is now. In one of these pieces, there is a discussion of Zionism not qualifying, or being, it's so distinct that it's not defined as settler colonialism.
Mm.
So that and that so on the one hand, I wanted to know what you thought about all of the specifying that goes on here. What is settler colonialism? What is franchise colonialism? What is strict colonialism? I mean, in one of the articles, I think in Max Eichel's article, he's talking about Marx used to, in Marx's conception of colonialism, settler was already baked in, so that
Mm.
it didn't need the prefix descriptor we get today. But given all of that, what do you think of all of these differences and specificities? And then could it be? And then I am asking, I guess, could it be that they're trying to justify it because in their concept, that Zionism, at least in some concepts, or in one's conception, Zionism is not itself settler colonialism. It is its own distinct. And this is where, like, I admit, like, this is where I was like, on the one hand, I'm like, this is scholars trying to do too much. And on the other hand, I'm just saying, no, be more humble. You just don't understand. And I want to just get mad at everybody for saying, if Jared doesn't understand, then you're just doing too much. But I did find myself, here for this show, and for one I did a couple of weeks ago on my own show, trying to look at some of these questions, found myself struggling a little bit with some of, do I agree? Do I understand? Should there be all of these distinctions? So anyway, what do you think of these distinctions? And could it be that
Mm.
the journal was defending itself on the basis that it was arguing that there are arguments that Zionism is somehow its own distinct form, not to be defined as settler colonialism?
I think that they're like I think the authors we read would see Zionism as a form of settler colonialism, but I think the critiques of settler colonialism push back on, the idea that settler colonialism can be viewed as quote unquote anti-Semitic, right? Or anti-Semitism. And that's where you see this pushback happening in the public sphere. I do want to preface, like what I said earlier about when I adopted settler colonialism as a framework. I did, based on my previous reading, before reading Patrick Wolf, I did and still do view Black people in the United States as colonized. I think this was very much sharpened not by not by reading anything per se, but as seeing, like, in the context of in the Southwest, for example, where you have indigenous descent or indigenous descended people who aren't necessarily quote unquote indigenous or American Indian in the context that we are, because that's a political relationship, but are also colonized as a nation of people, right? And I did feel like the idea of settler colonialism, as it was being theorized by Wolf and these other theorists, was limiting in that sense, because, and that's why I kind of wrote the book in the way that I did, because I wasn't really concerned about so much as like proving the tenets of settler colonialism as I was about proving that resistance is foundational to this project, right? To overturn it eventually, looking only in the context of my limited view at American Indian people, but also looking at the alliances that they made, kind of prematurely, because I didn't know so much at the time as I do now, and it wasn't my goal at that particular time to look at it in that way. But I do sympathize with your frustrations in this kind of like splitting of hairs to kind of find out like what kind of colonialism is involved here. I think I think the John Bellamy Foster piece kind of does that, where he's like, he goes back to Marx, which is, I think he's trying to just show it within the Marxist tradition, and then like, but like really, I didn't see that when I read Capital the first time. I mean, I just didn't. It's not like why I was reading Capital either. Like, but
yeah, I don't honestly. I didn't even remember this part from Capital. It's been so long, and I've not properly studied the text. So reading, be mind people in the audience always remember reading and studying are not the same thing. So got to be sometimes be careful. But what I was
yeah.
thinking of was in the Bellamy piece, that just to your point about what uh he writes, talk about Rodinson or Fayez
Oh yeah.
Sayeg's talking about Rodinson. For Rodinson, Zionism thus representing colonialism in the classical Greek sense, that is, in the sense of the Athenian clergy, which eliminated or removed the native populations and replaced them with settlers, but as they're talking about in that section, it does not require the label of settler colonialism because it's already baked into the concept. So that's why I was trying to say, are they trying to be, maybe the journal thought of itself as being slick and saying, well, we see settler colonialism as distinct from the Greek form, and therefore, I don't know.
No, yeah, no, like exactly. Like, oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, no,
Like,
I don't
in other
think
words,
that
they
was
don't need to
intentional.
call it that. Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no,
Yeah.
no. I get what you're saying, and it's like, and we're like, the audience is probably like, what the hell are these guys talking about? But basically, what Bellamy Foster, John Bellamy Foster is saying in this piece is that you can go, like Marx was, looking at colonialism proper, which was this Greek Athenian, colonialism, which did require the removal of indigenous people. So he's looking at it in the quote unquote ancient form. But again, that doesn't really, in my, again, studying reading, but that didn't come across in my reading of Capital Volume 1.
Right. Yeah.
But I do appreciate his attempts to kind of look back at these early theorists, and even like, looking at the Comintern. Like I guess I never, again, I wasn't looking for those things. But it was fascinating to read them. And I think it helps me understand this within a larger sort of historical genealogy. But I also don't think that's what was radicalizing, the working class in some of these national liberation movements. I think what, Isle is saying is this idea of nationhood, a national liberation struggle, right? And that, in the context of the imperial core, like where we're at, this is kind of a little bit outside of the conversation that we're having, but there tends to be there's a tendency to sort of reduce class to like, we need the unification of the working class, but not understanding why class struggle is successful in other parts of the world. It's because they're tied to national liberation projects. It doesn't mean that, like the white nation in the United States doesn't need to organize as a nation. It's already got a state, but it's all another question. That's why settler colonialism is a useful theory. But that's like where, like what Gerald Horne says, and he's like, settler colonialism is about class collaboration, and thinking about it in a useful sense. Du Bois said this with the wages of whiteness, the psychological wages of whiteness, this idea that there's a unifying kind of like racial supremacy that kind of erases or collapses class differences, where you can have the Walmart checker identifying with Donald Trump, even though by class they have nothing in common. But then also I just wanted to make this point because it kind of got lost. But one thing that never gets talked about, I mean, I think something that I've that has come to the surface more in my understanding of like radical movements and national movements within the context of this settler colony, is that it's been, with at least within the quote unquote domestic sense, when Black people organize and mobilize, that's when shit changes in this country, right? And that's what's always represented as a threat, and it advances the class struggle, even when it's not given credit of doing so, and it's done so. And I'm like, going back, I watched your conversation with Frank Wilderson, and again, this there's this critique of Afro pessimism, but when you were talking about it, more so when you were talking about it than when he was talking about it, I understood like why, like it's essential and formative to the Black struggle, especially within the context of this longer history, because of the way that it gets co-opted, the way that it gets criminalized, the way that it gets even within the academy denigrated, as essentialist. And I was like, actually, you do need those spaces to have those conversations, because this is a real conversation. Like, it's not an abstract theory. Like, this is really happening in real time. You look at the concept of woke, like how that had, like, I remember when that concept came up, I was like, wow, that's so, like, to me personally, I was like, wow, that's so powerful. And now today it's like, it can be labeled anything, but it's attached to the Black struggle in a specific moment and period in time.
So one, I just want to acknowledge the comment that was raised a minute ago. I would love to facilitate a routine exchange between our platforms. So I'm down for that. And I would love to see more. I thought I saw Orasami Burton pop up in the chat. So I use him as an example of what I'm thinking here, that to the extent I can facilitate more conversation with even more expertise from the sort of the Black side of things, I'm happy to help with that as well. I'd even like to see others be assigned this exact same reading
Mm.
set and see what comes up in conversation there. So anyway, I love the comment. I'm down for all of that. If just yeah, let's build that. The damn, it's been a theme today. I'm
Oh
forgetting
wow,
again what I was going to say.
he's watching the this is cool. I am a
Oh,
big fan
Ori's
of
right
Tip of
there.
the Spear.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. I was actually
Please, anybody out
yeah,
there, if you have
read
not
his
read
book.
Tip of the Spear,
It's
you've
amazing.
got to read the book.
It's amazing.
So yeah, it really is. So so and I do, yeah, and I do like to acknowledge, and he's a perfect example that there are levels to this. They're like I'm not bad, but there are levels to this. So it can always you can elevate the conversation. But yeah, so there was something else I was going to say after that point that was supposed to have just been, and it'll I hope it comes back, because I've sorry, I've
No,
just lost my thought.
I was just talking about
Yeah.
how I think the larger point I was making is like how, especially in the 20th century, well, I mean, even in the 19th century and throughout the history of the United States, it's like when the Black freedom movement has moved,
Yes.
it's it's seen as a threat, and it has to be you know co-opted or denigrated or criminalized or destroyed through all
Yeah.
kinds of
No.
means.
Yeah. A lot of that. So that is absolutely the point, and I think that's one of the reasons why I was attracted to the internal colonialism theory back in grad school, because uh, it itself was targeted
Mm,
as a theoretical approach. To this day, it's seen as controversial. But to me, it leads to conversations like this, and for me, puts Black America back in conversation with radically struggling communities elsewhere. So that was always my, well, again, part of what attracted me to it, that narrow focuses on. So this was Malcolm X's point. We've been talking a lot about him, given this the anniversary of
mhm,
his assassination the other day, but this was Malcolm's, one of Malcolm's point, not only in using the colonial analogy, but in wanting Black people in this country to return, as John Henrik Clarke said, to their proper role in the world stage, uh, uh, both of civilization and of struggle. And why Malcolm wanted to bring the struggle from civil to human rights, to take
mm,
Black people out of the suppressive and narrow confines of the experience here, and to say, no, 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 we are part of a global struggle. And so that's what I've always liked about this. So whether it's my approach to Afro pessimism, which, to be fair, a lot of people do not agree with, and or even internal colonialism, which also a lot of people don't agree with. My point is to say, to start with the specifics of Black America, for those who have that either background or interest, and to have that, but not to have it leave us there, to say that, to have it encourage us into other areas of struggle in solidarity with others at the most, again, militant forms of that sort of coming together. And yeah, so yeah, and I would encourage, so yeah, I hope the links to what we read are made available. I hope
Yeah.
people read them. I would love it if you and some others picked up these exact same readings and saw how other kinds of conversations went. Queen Mother Moore is quoted in the first, of Tip of the
Mhm.
Spears outlining Black nation and internal colonial. Exactly, exactly. Um, so yeah,
Well,
yeah.
Dr. Jared A. Ball. Before we got on this whole thing, we had a whole thing about calling each other doctors, so I thought I'd just throw that in
Yeah,
there.
that's funny. That was a good one
But
too.
I really appreciate you taking the time to read these articles. I do want to invite you back on because there's so much here to talk about. There's so much that I have to learn. And I think more importantly, though, I used to be like, I think as an organizer and I'm more in like dad mode now. So like I can't be everywhere all the time. I'm more in front of the mic than I have been in the past, just because of changes in my personal life. But I've been thinking a lot about how as an organizer, somebody on the streets, I was always this like confrontational politics was like something that I was into, and it didn't really bleed over into my academic work. But now I'm thinking more and more as especially with this genocide in Gaza, but also just looking back and like my bookshelf, if a bookshelf can be a mixtape, it's very much changing, and it's very much the way that I'm thinking about things. Like I used to kind of, I'm going to be honest, I used to kind of dismiss the idea of decolonizing one's mind because it's like there's a physical world out there that we have to confront and be a part of.
Mm,
But the more that I've been able to kind of reflect on on this time period, it's like actually that is an essential element in this moment in time. Like there's so much propaganda out there. I mean, I say that like that's easy to say, but just seeing how these narratives have been repeated and have facilitated and justified killing, maiming, torturing, and the complete strangling of any sort of alternative, political or social alternative in this moment in time is has really opened my eyes to how indoctrinated uh people, even some of my friends and comrades, are to the American project, and how much more work we actually have to do, and how important your work is, and kind of challenging that, but also making sure that we're sharp and studied when it comes to when it comes to doing this kind of intellectual combat. So yeah, I just want to thank you so much for kind of being part of that, because there are very few voices out there. I'm just honestly, there's very few voices out there that you can find on the internet where you're going to encounter this kind of perspective.
so again, the feelings are mutual. I deeply appreciate this. I'll be honored to come back here. We're definitely going to be inviting you back over on our side of things. And I also agree with that last point. It's kind of similar to what you were saying earlier about woke and other things. Like I have had a similar disposition to the phrase decolonizing the mind, or decolonizing this, or or the colonize that, and the colon, because I've always seen it as a distraction from the actual
Mhm.
colonization that's happening, and the actual, but it is, but it's just what I think both of us are just having a reaction to the constant co-optation and corruption of concepts and ideas, names, symbols, etc. So it is important to decolonize the mind. It is important to be woke. It is
Mhm.
important, to engage, at the, to get to the uncorrupted version of these concepts and ideas. And listen, this has been great. This whole the last couple weeks, I think, because I think it's been like 2 weeks since you sent the first reading or whatever. I love this, and I really appreciate it, and I love the intellectual stretching. I love the expansion of both of our intellectual mixtapes. I think that's, part of what this is all about. And big salute to you and your crew, and to your audience, and thanks. This has been, I really appreciate it. I love it. Love it.
Well, thanks for joining. You can check Jared Ball out on I Mix What I Like on YouTube. I think you guys have a podcast too. Also check out Black Liberation Media. You have a
Absolutely.
great website where you can find all your books for free, digital versions of your books and your work there. So thanks again, Jared, and be well.
No, thank you. You too. And as always, peace. Only if you're willing to fight for it, as Fred Hampton used to say. And thank you all very much. Peace. Peace.